When a room full of arrogant mathematicians tried to break her spirit, they never expected she'd solve an equation that had stumped PhD candidates for decades. In that moment, their laughter turned to stunned silence. The murmurs of disbelief rippled through the prestigious Thompson Hall at Stanford University. Sarah Chand stood at the blackboard, chalk dust coating her fingers, as she wrote the final line of an equation that had haunted the field of vector calculus for years. Behind her, 30 of the brightest mathematical minds in the country sat in absolute silence, their earlier mockery frozen on their faces. Just 2 hours earlier, they had been so certain of their superiority. The annual Mathematics Research Symposium had drawn the most brilliant doctoral candidates and professors from across the nation. They had dismissed her the moment she walked in, just another undergraduate, clearly out of her depth among such distinguished company. Professor Marcus Harrison, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, had been particularly cruel. "Perhaps," he had drawled, tapping his Mont Blanc pen against the conference table, "you'd be more comfortable in a basic calculus review session?" The room had erupted in knowing chuckles. They had seen her type before, young students who thought their perfect GPAs made them special. Sarah had felt every snicker like a physical blow, but her hand remained steady as she opened her notebook. The equations within represented months of work, countless nights spent pursuing an elegant solution to a problem that had frustrated mathematicians for generations. They thought she was there to learn from them. They were wrong. "Actually," she had replied, her voice quiet but unwavering, "I believe I found a novel approach to Birkenstein's vector integration paradox." The laughter had died instantly. Professor Harrison's pen stopped mid-tap. The Birkenstein paradox wasn't something undergraduate students casually solved over summer break. It had resisted solution for 20 years, leaving a trail of failed attempts and broken academic careers in its wake. "Really?" Harrison's voice dripped with condescension. "Please, enlighten us." He gestured to the blackboard, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The trap was set. Let the naive student embarrass herself and reinforce the natural order of things. But as Sarah began to write, something changed in the room. The standard equations came first, familiar territory that no one could dispute. Then came her innovation, an entirely new way of approaching the problem that made the gathered academics lean forward in their seats. The mockery faded, replaced by an electric tension that built with each line she added to the board. If you're enjoying this incredible journey of mathematical triumph, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now, 2 hours later, Sarah added the final symbol to her proof. The chalk made a decisive click as she set it down. She turned to face the room, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "As you can see, by approaching the integration from this perspective, the paradox resolves itself naturally." The silence stretched for what felt like eternity. Professor Harrison stood up slowly, his face unreadable. He walked to the board, scanning each line of her work with intense concentration. The other mathematicians held their breath, waiting for him to find the flaw, the mistake that would justify their earlier dismissal. But Sarah knew there was no mistake to find. She had checked and rechecked every step, every assumption, every conclusion. The solution was elegant, irrefutable, and entirely her own. Harrison turned to face her, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes. There was something else, something that looked remarkably like respect. But Sarah's victory was far from complete. As the implications of her proof began to sink in, the room's atmosphere shifted again. Some of the gathered mathematicians weren't ready to accept that their assumptions, about both the paradox and about her, had been wrong. The real battle was just beginning. The whispers started at the back of the room. "There must be something wrong," muttered Dr. Jameson from Yale, his fingers nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "The implications if she's right." He trailed off, shaking his head. Sarah remained standing at the board, her posture straight despite the weight of 30 skeptical stares. She had anticipated this, the resistance, the desperate search for flaws, the unwillingness to accept that an undergraduate student could succeed where they had failed. Professor Harrison's voice cut through the murmurs. "Ms. Chun," he said, testing each word carefully, Your approach is unconventional. But before we discuss its validity, perhaps you could demonstrate your understanding by solving a few preliminary problems. The challenge in his voice was clear. This wasn't about testing her knowledge, it was about putting her in her place. Several of his colleagues nodded approvingly, already reaching for their notebooks to construct the most difficult equations they could imagine. Of course, Sarah replied, picking up the chalk again. She had prepared for this too. Years of being underestimated had taught her that one victory was never enough. She would have to prove herself again and again. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from MIT stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Let's start with something basic, she said, though the equation she wrote on the board was anything but basic. It was a complex vector calculus problem, the kind that regularly stumped doctoral candidates. Sarah studied it for exactly 3 seconds before beginning her solution. The chalk moved across the board in swift, confident strokes. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just pure mathematical precision. She finished in under 2 minutes. Would anyone like to verify the answer? She asked, stepping back from the board. The room was silent again, but this time with a different quality. A dawning realization that they weren't dealing with a lucky guess or a memorized solution. Professor Harrison cleared his throat. Perhaps something more challenging. He stepped up to the board, erasing her previous work. What he wrote next made several observers inhale sharply. It was a problem from last year's Fields medal competition, one that had taken the winner nearly an hour to solve. Sarah felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She recognized the problem immediately. She had solved it for fun one weekend, then developed 3 alternative approaches just to challenge herself. Without a word, she began writing, her mind already 5 steps ahead of her hand. If you're captivated by this battle of minds, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. The best is yet to come. The room watched in stunned silence as she worked. 10 minutes later, she not only had the solution but had included 2 different approaches, each more elegant than the last. Professor Harrison's face had gone pale, but it was Dr. Rodriguez who escalated the challenge to its next level. Very impressive, she said, her voice tight with something between admiration and disbelief. But these are known problems with known solutions. Perhaps we should see how you handle something new. The equation she wrote next was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. It combined elements of vector calculus with theoretical physics in a way that seemed almost deliberately perverse. Several of the watching mathematicians leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested. This wasn't just a test anymore, it was a genuine mathematical challenge. Sarah studied the board, her mind already breaking down the problem into its component parts. She could feel the weight of expectation in the room, the collective hope that this would finally be the challenge that proved too much for her. They were about to be disappointed again. Sarah's chalk touched the board, and the room collectively held its breath. What happened next would change not just her future, but their understanding of mathematical possibility. The first line of her solution made Dr. Rodriguez's eyebrows rise. The second line caused Professor Harrison to lean forward in his chair. By the third line, notebooks were appearing across the room as the gathered mathematicians scrambled to follow her logic. She was doing something none of them had seen before. Instead of attacking the problem head-on, she was restructuring it, transforming the seemingly impossible equation into something else entirely. Her mind worked in layers, each step revealing new patterns that had been invisible moments before. "Wait," interrupted Dr. Jameson, standing up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "That transformation in step 4, that's not possible. You can't just—" Sarah didn't pause in her writing. "The Cavenaughtian theorem proves it is possible," she said calmly, continuing to work. "I published it in the International Journal of Advanced Mathematics last month." A ripple of disbelief went through the room. Several people pulled out their phones, quickly searching for the paper. She could hear their sharp intakes of breath as they found it, a revolutionary theorem that had been largely overlooked because of its author's undergraduate status. "Impossible," someone whispered, but the proof was right there on the board, building step by step into something undeniable. Sarah's hand moved with increasing speed, as if the mathematics itself was pulling her forward. Professor Harrison had gone completely still, his eyes tracking every symbol she wrote. 20 years of teaching, and he had never seen anything like this. The girl wasn't just solving the problem. She was redefining their understanding of what was possible. The final line of her solution seemed to hang in the air for a moment before she underlined it with a decisive stroke. The chalk snapped in her hand from the pressure, but she barely noticed. "There," she said, turning to face the room. "The solution exists in 5-dimensional space, but its implications extend to practical applications in quantum computing and advanced cryptography." The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Rodriguez walked slowly to the board, her hand trembling slightly as she traced the equations. "This is..." She paused, searching for words. "This is beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of research." Professor Harrison stood up, his face unreadable. "Ms. Chun," he said, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "I believe we owe you an apology, and perhaps a job offer." But before Sarah could respond, a voice from the back of the room cut through the moment. "It's a trick," Dr. Whitman from Berkeley declared, standing up. "It has to be. No undergraduate could possibly." Sarah turned back to the board, chalk dust falling from her fingers like snow. "Shall I explain it again?" she asked quietly. "Or would you prefer to solve it yourself?" The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. The room was about to witness either her final triumph or her ultimate humiliation. And Sarah Chun was just getting started. The tension in Thompson Hall had reached a breaking point. Dr. Whitman strode to the board, snatching up a piece of chalk. "Very well," he said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "Let's see you solve this." What he wrote next wasn't just a problem. It was a mathematical gauntlet, a twisted combination of vector calculus and abstract algebra that he'd been working on for his next research paper. It was deliberately complex, purposefully cruel. Sarah didn't even blink. Instead, she smiled a small, knowing smile that made Dr. Whitman's hand tighten around the chalk. She had seen through his strategy immediately. The equation wasn't just difficult. It was impossible. Or rather, it was designed to appear impossible. "Before I solve this," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I should point out that you've included a subtle trap in the third term. The integration limits create a false paradox." Dr. Whitman's face went white. She hadn't just understood the problem. She had seen through his attempt to embarrass her. The room's atmosphere shifted again, this time with a mix of admiration and embarrassment for their colleague's transparent ploy. Sarah stepped forward, taking a fresh piece of chalk. "However," she continued, "if we approach it like this..." Her hand began to move across the board, crafting a solution that would be discussed in mathematical circles for years to come. If you're enjoying this tale of intellectual triumph, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Mathematical justice is best served with an audience. As she worked, the equations seemed to flow from her mind directly onto the board, each step more elegant than the last. She wasn't just solving the problem. She was transforming it, revealing layers of mathematical beauty that even Dr. Whitman hadn't realized were there. Professor Harrison watched with growing amazement as she built her solution. This wasn't just genius. This was something entirely new. Sarah Chun wasn't playing by their rules. She was writing her own. 20 minutes later, she placed the final period after her solution. The proof was beautiful in its simplicity, devastating in its completeness. Dr. Whitman had slumped back into his chair, all pretense of superiority abandoned. "The solution," Sarah said, turning to face the room, "not only resolves the apparent paradox but opens up new possibilities in quantum field theory. I'd be happy to discuss the implications with anyone who's interested." The silence that followed was different from any that had come before. It was the silence of a paradigm shifting, of preconceptions shattering, of a new voice demanding to be heard in the world of mathematics. Professor Harrison stood up slowly, applauding. The sound was quickly joined by others, building into a thunderous ovation. Even Dr. Whitman, after a long moment, joined in. "Ms. Chun," Professor Harrison said when the applause finally died down, "I believe you've just revolutionized 2 fields of mathematics in one afternoon. Would you consider joining our research team? As a lead investigator, of course." Sarah looked around the room at the faces that had dismissed her just hours before. Now they looked at her with respect, admiration, and more than a little fear. She had done more than prove a theorem. She had proven that brilliance doesn't conform to their expectations. "Thank you, Professor," she said, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "But I already have an offer from the Institute for Advanced Study. They seem quite interested in my approach to the Riemann hypothesis." The room erupted in gasps. The Riemann hypothesis, the holy grail of mathematics. If she had made progress there. As Sarah gathered her notebooks, preparing to leave, she turned back one last time. "Never assume," she said quietly, "that someone's capabilities are limited by your perception of them." And there you have it, friends. If you've enjoyed this tale of mathematical triumph and justice, make sure to subscribe and join us for more stories of brilliant minds breaking barriers. The day Sarah Chen walked out of Thompson Hall, she left behind more than just solved equations. She left a room full of brilliant mathematicians questioning everything they thought they knew about mathematics, about capability, and about the power of underestimating others. And somewhere in Stanford University, a young student who had been watching from the back of the room felt a spark of inspiration. Perhaps they too would one day stand at that board, chalk in hand, ready to change the world through the pure, undeniable power of mathematical truth.